Great. So thanks everyone for joining the Polycon UK webinar today. We have Catherine de Vries from Bocconi, who is going to be presenting the effects of a wall, gender attitudes and political involvement in unified Germany, which is joint work with Diana O'Brien. So before I hand over to Catherine, let me remind you that these webinars take place every 2 weeks on Mondays at 3 p.m. UK time. We're going to take a little bit of a break over the next few weeks, but we're going to be back on April 19th with Stefan Walton. And you can find our updated program for the next term on our website. You can also follow us on Twitter for all the updates, and you can watch past talks on our YouTube channel. So just to remind you, the format of the seminar is going to be a 45 to 50-minute presentation followed by a Q&A. If you have any clarifying question during the talk, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them, or just type them in the chat and I will be moderating them. And then if you have more substantial questions, we can discuss them at the Q&A. After the Q&A, so at the end of the hour, we will be finishing the official part of the seminar, but if we're gonna be online for another few minutes, if you want to stay and chat informally. So Catherine, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. You have the floor.
Hi, thank you, Ariana. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the opportunity to present the paper. So this is really, we have results and so on like that, but especially on the kind of mechanism part later on the paper, we really are soliciting kind of comments. And so, if you have ideas later on, any questions of clarification, please feel free to ask now. So this is joint work with Diana O'Brien, who's at Rice University, who is currently on maternity leave. So I'll be doing the presentations and the Q&A this time around. Let me just see that I can. Let me see. It's not. Yes, you can see the next slide now, right? Okay, great. So thanks so much for having me. I just wanted to kind of talk about in this particular paper, we're going to try to understand, not perfectly identify, really not, but try to understand a little bit where gender norms might come from, or gender attitudes towards gender roles might come from, and the extent to which a political system or a way in which the political system is drafting these kind of ideas about gender norms might have an effect. And then later on, specifically, we're trying to understand how gender norms affect political involvement and do that correlationally, and then move into an instrumental variable approach to do that, and then say at the end something about a possible mechanism. But before I do that, I have an intrinsic interest also in being a Dean of Diversity and Inclusion to think about gender norms, but not all of us might have, and especially to think about them in a political sense. So I just wanted to kind of illustrate that actually this particular pandemic, where we all are, and some of us might be homeschooling, some of us might not be, but actually what we saw is a little bit of a behavioral aspect when we looked at, this is an ongoing survey where people are plotting basically how much time they're spending with their children. So mothers and fathers are doing this in terms of child play and also in terms of child care activities. And then we looked at like the kind of the normal year, which is kind of the blue line, and then looked at the pandemic year. And what you can see here on the right is actually for fathers, there's been not a lot of difference in the extent to which there's time spent with the child or a child caring activity that's been conducted. However, with mothers, we saw a huge increase in the amount of time that was done, hence indicating, which also many other studies have already highlighted, also by Paolo Profeta and Vincenzo Galasso, so colleagues of mine at Bocconi, that actually this has fallen disproportionately on women. And one aspect that's kind of a bit of the elephant in the room, that this might be because of persistent gender norms that both mothers and fathers hold about who, what is a mom or a woman supposed to do and what is a man supposed to do. And we see these kind of popping up at times in different parts, in this case in the pandemic. I'm not going to talk here about the pandemic, but I think it's a nice illustration of the kind of problematic that I'm going to talk about. Yes. So overall, from a kind of political science literature, and especially gender and politics literature, we know that women overall are less politically involved than men. Sorry, it's going a bit slow. Yes. So women are, for example, less interested in politics than men. This is just taken from the World Values Survey. We're taking the gap. So it's the percentage of men in a survey that say that they're interested in politics. No, all self-reported. We don't, it's just as an illustration. We don't do anything of this in the paper, and the percentage of women saying the same, that they are very or somewhat interested in politics. There's variation across contexts, but overall we see these bars being upward, i.e. that men are more interested on average in terms of self-declared interest than women. The same would go for discussing politics. So these are the percentages of men versus women that say that they discuss politics frequently. Here also, again, variation across countries, but overall a positive gender gap. That means that men are more likely to say that they discuss politics frequently, much more so than women. Also more likely to contact politicians than men, the exception being New Zealand. That might also be that New Zealand has a particular prime minister at the moment, quite explicit when it comes to gender norms. But interestingly, we see overall across the board in many of these things, something that the gender and politics literature has already, kind of illustrated, that a lot of these gender gaps in involvement, may they either be, in terms of interest or might they be in terms of behavior, that oftentimes men are more politically involved than women. So that's not new. We know that from the literature, and we also know from the literature that this might have particular consequences. So these inequalities in political involvement, which might stem from many different things, in this case, we focus on gender, might undermine the quality of deliberation, representation, legitimacy of the democratic process, and gender equity in political interest and discussion has the potential to widen the scope of policy demands and even perhaps change the nature of the democratic process. And, I don't have to say it also within the UK. Recently, we've had discussions among the police and women very vividly in the public debate. So we know that women are overall less likely to be politically involved than men, but we lack sometimes a little bit the clear answer as why this is the case. We're not going to solve that particular puzzle here, but we're going to add a part of the puzzle that's often discussed, but not really empirically established in a way that we could be, increase our confidence that this really is a factor. And we're particularly going to focus here on the attitudes that people have about gender roles. So, as I said, there is this established finding in the literature that women are that men are disproportionately more often to be politically involved, politically interested, active in politics, but women less so. And this literature on the kind of political gender gap and political involvement points towards two sets of factors. So the first set of factors is individual level factors, specifically women's lower level of civic resources. So think about time. I just illustrated that. Women are often disproportionately engaged in child-rearing activities or other caring duties that might lack time to spend these resources in the public sphere. They, on average, of course, what we know from the gender wage gap, have less money to their disposal, might have less access to networks that are already there in politics. And these might be individual level factors that contribute to the fact that women are less politically involved than men. And of course, the work by Stanley Verba and Nancy Burns and others has established this quite clearly already in the past. Another set of factors that is discussed are contextual factors. So the role of economic development, i.e. that more economic development would lead to less of a political gender gap, more egalitarian involvement between men and women. Role model effects, Laurie Berman and co-authors randomly assigned women to Indian Municipal Council, a paper I think in Science or Nature, I think it's in Science, where they show that these role model effects have an important effect on women's educational attainment, but also on the willingness for women to become more active in public life. And also institutional effect, for example, of course, things like quotas that might have an effect on women being more represented in politics and therefore also women being participating more, but also things like the electoral system, party system characteristics that might affect the political gender gaps in political participation and engagement that we observe. So what our focus is here is often on kind of a latent variable, if you will, in the room, or an elephant in the room, and that's traditional gender role attitudes. So it's often discussed, and it's also very often discussed when you are talking to policymakers or if you're talking to just kind of people in the pub, if you will. But actually, a lot of the research has been, has had a difficulty in basically gaining some traction on this level of explanation. Oftentimes, because a lot of us who study a lot of political behavior, things that our culture often are the error term, the things that we can't explain. But here we're trying to kind of pick up on that and try to, present a design that can allow us to maybe, delve into this a little bit deeper. But as I said, it's far from perfect. So any suggestion you might have is really very welcome. So let me first kind of define traditional gender role attitudes. So these are essentialist beliefs and views that assign certain traits, characteristics, or roles of responsibility predominantly to one sex over the other. So that's in a kind of as a summary. Men are seen as autonomous, self-reliant, engaging primarily in the public sphere, of course, then politics being part of the public sphere, women being more passive, nurturing, and focusing on the private sphere. For example, caretaking, childcare, etc. So intuitively, a lot of work suggests that traditional gender attitudes should matter for women's political involvement, but we haven't seen so much evidence that's really convincing on this question. So first, that results from socialization literature have been kind of mixed on this particular element. So it's also overall difficult to really establish a causal link. But then even if women with more gender egalitarian attitudes are more involved, what's the exact nature of this relationship? We could be a bit worried about what's exactly going on. So just to, so just to give you some of the concerns that we might have. So citizens and countries might display more gender egalitarian attitudes precisely because women engage and participate more in politics. Respondents in a survey, for example, that hold traditional gender attitudes might also differ from their more egalitarian counterparts in a number of other ways that we then cannot hold constant. So we don't know what that particular effect of traditional gender attitudes is vis-a-vis other things in which respondents differ. And then also, especially with some of the work that's out there that really is comparing countries, I'm just saying it for the sake of illustration, let's say Sweden and Italy or something like that would compare that, or let's say Sweden and Greece. So that's the issue there, of course, is that there are many other things that differ between Sweden and Italy, or that differ between Sweden and Greece. One, very proponent element would already be religion, for example, but also things about state capacity, things about a level, moving towards historical paths towards democratization. We can think of many, many, many different factors. So countries in which citizens on average express gender traditional attitudes differ from more egalitarian states on many dimensions, and it's very difficult to isolate that. So what we try to do here is we try to kind of rely on a historical context, which was the separation of Germany, as a way to try to see what the effect can be of traditional gender attitudes on citizens' political involvement. Note that, of course, we cannot randomly assign gender attitudes to people. So, and if we do, I don't think we will get any ethical approval for that anymore. So in that way, we're trying to do kind of a best thing to do that. But I'm perfectly open for the fact that there are also issues with this type of design as well. But hopefully, we can improve on what's been done in the past. So the case study that we basically take here is post-war Germany, and we're not the first, of course, especially a lot of the work in on historical political economy by someone like Sascha Becker has done a lot of this working on Germany. I will also talk a little bit about some other aspects in which these parts might differ in a minute, but so basically, to just kind of refresh our memory, and I'm not going to go through the history of this, but of course, after the Second World War, start of the Cold War, Germany was partitioned into the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic. I'm just going to refer to that as East and West in this case. And they differed very much in especially the role that the state attributed to women. So Germany, according to Esping Andersen, who developed his classification of welfare states in Europe, put Germany as the prototype of a conservative welfare state. So really a male breadwinner model and very low levels of women education. And we went through kind of the educational manual that teachers get. It's quite striking if you read, for example, manuals of the early 60s from Bavaria, about how they refer to women in the classroom. So not only that women, are not allowed in certain higher levels and especially STEM-related educational spheres, but also that they were, for example, not even doing certain types of things at school because they were associated as being better to do social care and other aspects at school and not so much math, for example. So it's really quite traditional. So then the German Democratic Republic, and I'm not going to refer here that, there are many, many, many issues with the communist legacy and what that system entailed, but it had one particular element that it was much more progressive in the way that we would look at it now to involving women in the public sphere. And that it was very much a socialist state, a dual earner model, high levels of women education, also leading to high levels of women into the labor force, and also providing forms of childcare way before other countries. Here also to illustrate that with kind of a campaign posters from the Social Democratic Party in Germany. So I didn't take the Christian Democratic Party, which would even become more conservative, but here you already see the woman, holding, creating the baby, being, thinking about her house, and then together for a free and better future. Whereas the SED, so the German Communist Party, the East German Communist Party, the same pay for the same work, we are for full gender equality of women. I do want to pause here a little bit and put a footnote here. Of course, this didn't mean, in comparison to West Germany, the East was very gender progressive when it came to allowing women to go into especially tertiary education and also to get jobs. However, the top of the regime was still very male, right? That's to be very clear about that. But actually the top of some companies was at least had more female managers than it was in the West. But you can of course talk a little bit about a double standard when it comes to real political power, right? So in that way, it would be interesting to establish also if there's this link to political involvement. But overall, when it comes to the gender norms that were portrayed, it's very clear. Interestingly, so when you read some of the manuals that are still available from high school and teachers and professors in East Germany, it reads a lot of the stuff that I'm doing as a Dean of Diversity and Inclusion right now. It talks about implicit bias, about how we shouldn't associate certain things to women and men. So in that way, it reads very progressive, right? As I said, not to say that the East was progressive on other areas, but it was progressive in giving this access to education for women especially. So what do we kind of then expect on the basis of this case study, how we can leverage it to the question that we have on the role of gender, traditional attitudes to political involvement later on. So the separation and reunification of Germany presents us with an interesting context to examine the influence of gender attitudes on political involvement. So what we want to demonstrate, and hopefully can convince you of, that this semi-exogenously imposed East-West divide shaped traditional gender attitudes, and that socialization in more gender egalitarian East, so GDR, should lead East German to hold less traditional gender role attitudes. And we're also going to look at the length of the socialization, and we're going to look at some alternative explanations. And I just also want to mention that in the supporting information, we also compare East-West Protestant states to East-West Catholic states, because you could think of that there is other legacies that play in, right, that do a role. Also, we look at it from using state fixed effects, so German Bundesländer state fixed effects, just to make sure that there's not another legacy going on, and that holds. So then in the next step, we want to examine whether the attitudes then affect political involvement. So they correlate negatively to question if they correlate indeed negatively with women's political participation, thus exacerbating the presence of the gender gap. And we're also going to try to convince you that borrowing from economics, taking an instrumental variable approach, that this might also be a causal effect of gender role attitudes on political involvement. And at the end, I'm going to say something about the mechanism, but there I hope that you also give me some pushback, because I think it needs some work. So the data. So what we do is we use the German General Social Survey. Of course, we would like to have had attitudinal data within the GDR and within West Germany, but it doesn't exist. And if it exists, there might be some concerns about the validity of it overall. But it allows us to harvest different surveys between 1991 and 2016, where the questions that we're interested in, so those that tap into traditional gender norms and those that tap into political involvement, are there, plus of course also socioeconomic controls. So just to give you a little bit of a flavor of the dependent variable, and we construct a scale just to convert, to deal with problems of potentially measurement error if we just do this in a one shot. So what we do is we have 6 items. So a working mother can establish just as loving and a secure relationship with her children as mothers who don't work. It's more important for a wife to help her husband's career than her own. blah, blah, blah. And then a married woman should not work if there's limited number of jobs and her husband is able to support the family. Of course, also, some of these might be more relevant in the later part of the survey than the beginning, but we do have quite a lot of variation on this scale. Yes. So on political engagement and participation, so in this presentation, I will focus on what we do in the core element of the paper on political interest and on party membership. But then also in the supporting information, we have turnout and union membership as well. So the dependent variables then are in these two stages. Remember, it's first to kind of establish this effect of being socialized in these regimes on holding traditional gender attitudes or more egalitarian gender attitudes. That's that scale from 1 to 19, and then 19 means more traditional, 1 means more egalitarian. That's the dependent variable in the first part. So it really captures these questions on motherhood, employment, and marital roles that I showed you. Then the second part is trying to establish where then that gender attitudes becomes the independent variable for the political engagement and participation questions, political interest and party membership. And then we also engage in an instrumental variable, but I will talk about that. So the independent variables on an east-west, note that we have both if the person is living in the East and the West now, but also where they were born and socialized most. And it actually doesn't, there's some, because one could be worried about East to West migration. There's not been a lot of West to East migration, but East to West migration, in our survey, the results hold. They're slightly stronger, of course, when we focus only on those that were socialized and born in the East. Birth cohort survey years. I'll tell you something about the specification in a minute. And then, of course, we have the independent variable traditional gender attitudes when we try to predict political involvement. So now, and then controls, education, employment, income, marital status, religiosity, religious denomination, and household size. Those are all things that are associated, especially with traditional gender norms, but also with these other alternative explanations for involvement that I talked about with the traditional gender gap. And also when we try to predict political involvement, we also try one where we have interpersonal trust and not, because that's been one of the discussions within the East German literature. Anyway, it's a bit specific, but. So on the methods, so this is not so easy to do, right? It sounds great, but it's not so easy to do in the sense that we have to distinguish birth cohorts from age effects during a life cycle and period effects based on exposure to the same contemporaneous events. So that is oftentimes done via APC models, but only 2 of those can really be identified. And then kind of statistical APC models are often very complex, making a whole set of assumptions that we might be not so comfortable with. So one of the solutions, especially in economics by Fischke and his work on curriculum change in Bavaria, is the solution to create kind of a group, he tries to add a control group and that's as a solution to work that creates some kind of group cohorts on the basis of, for example, 10 years, but that's a bit arbitrary. Why would we take these 10 years? Why don't we take other years, right? So what Fischke really tries to do is to take an individual year of birth and then adding to that a control group. So in a treated group to a particular, in his case, policy change, in our case, a particular historical legacy, and that's the way to estimate it. So what we then do is we follow, that should be the treated, that should be between quotation marks, but we follow the approach by Elias Dinas and Laura Stoker, where we basically have as treated those that are from the East, so a specific aspect of historical context. Note, I already told you, it's more tricky to say what we're exactly treating about the GDR, right? So we're kind of treating, let's say, these policies that push women into the public sphere, but like later on the mechanism to exactly estimate that, it's probably tricky. I'm just going to be open about that. And then the untreated being the West. So in order to obtain then an estimate of the treatment effects, what one then does is one estimates those cohort effects, so the birth years, separately for the treated and untreated group. But of course, you need to hold then one of these other effects constant as an assumption, right? Otherwise, you can't estimate the model. So what we do here is we hold the age effects constant. We have run the different specification, but that seems to be the best fit. So what we basically do is we model the 2 subgroups, so East versus West, within each cohort. So it's an interaction between both cohorts and being from the East or being from the West. So we're, let's say, comparing people who were born in 1917 from the East versus the West, if you will, right? And then assuming that the age effect is the same across the groups, we have to make some assumptions to estimate this. We tested alternative specifications, for example, by holding period effects constant, which I think makes less sense. We probably would expect that as people become older, they become a slightly more traditional. That's what the research tells us. So it makes less sense, I think, to hold a period effects constant, but that also works to some extent. But as I said already, holding the age constant is the best fit. So what we do here is then basically from that model where we estimate whether the dependent variable is having traditional gender attitudes, the independent variable is then having that birth year interacted with being treated or not, east or west. We estimate this with a whole set of controls, without a whole set of controls. And of course, we add period effects and also survey fixed effects because we have repeated cross-sectional surveys, right? But also different specifications yield very similar results. Here you see also a bit of the share of respondents in these particular birth cohorts, right? Note that at the beginning and the end, of course, there's a higher bar because we have less people that are born, that are very old or are very young in our survey, right? So we have to group some birth years together. But also that when we play around with that in the supporting information doesn't substantially change our results. So what you see from here is then basically the line of being in the treated group, let's say the east. So that's that dark line, and the dotted line is being in the west, right? What the effect of being born in that particular year is on traditional gender attitudes. And what you see here is that where in the West, you see the kind of generational replacement story, right? So over time, people become more gender egalitarian. Remember, lower values on the y-axis is being more gender egalitarian, higher is being more gender traditional. In the GDR, you see the move fairly quickly than when people who are socialized young within the kind of Cold War period from the mid 1950s onwards, and that then kind of remains stable across. Interestingly, I'm not going to make too much out of that. There seems to be a crossover again recently between the GDR, so between the East and the West. And a lot of the literature that we've been looking into, anthropological literature, a lot of German literature, and also some interviews that we've done with people who were in the Bundestag, so MEPs who are from East Germany, that what happened very much in the East is that basically all the more traditional gender policies from the West were transplanted into the East. And that had very much to do with the fact that there was the idea that, communism was no good, right? So we were not going to, we were going to replace it with a lot of the elements from the West. I'm not saying here that that is exactly what's going on, so that, but it's interesting. It at least fits this idea. I'm not going to make too much out of that because it's too short of a time, but it's illustrative of the fact that these type of policies might matter.
Can I ask a short question about that as well?
Sure.
At the beginning of that, I would also expect a crossing point. So they would start in the same...
Definitely. So you see it a little bit. Of course, you have huge confidence intervals because you have less observations there, right? But of course, you have to understand in a sense, and I will show you later on, that even older generations, so there is some evidence that we have from other surveys that seems to be the case for the older generation. But of course, even the older generations are then being treated in the GDR, right? So it's very difficult to fully isolate that kind of effect. I will show you later on that the longer you've been socialized in the GDR, the bigger the difference is, which would be illustrative that the regime, quote unquote, did something, right? But I definitely think we make a little bit of an argument in the paper, if you had time to look at it, that indeed that was, of course, a very conservative time, right? So it's quite conservative for both of those groups, right? In the sense it was, it was the Nazi time, which was, as we all know, a very conservative idea, especially for women having to produce soldiers on the battlefield, etc., right? This kind of rhetoric. But I think the issue, of course, is a little bit that people within the GDR will be treated, and they might also be treated to the fact that they see things happening to their daughters or to their sons, right? So I definitely see that, and we illustrate that, and I think it is closer to some extent, but it's not going to be perfect, I guess, is if that makes sense, Mac. So one worry we might be is to say, I give you a little bit of a spiel at the beginning about, this the GDR provides all these kind of possibilities for women, right? So it provides these educational attainment, it provides these working possibilities. So then maybe it just might be a difference of resources, right? So the fact that like what this is all driven by is that women in the GDR have just more resources, and therefore they start behaving more quote unquote enlightened or have more egalitarian attitudes. So then what we should see is that we should see very little difference between East and West men. right? So that would be that they are quote unquote not treated because they are similarly both in the public sphere in both of these systems, right? So here what we do is we split actually the groups by having East, so the sample by men and women creates about a 50-50 split, of course, demographically. And what we see here is that there is a difference that both men and women socialized in the East hold more traditional gender attitudes, and actually the effect is slightly larger among men. It's quite interesting the set that we see that throughout. That it could also well be, you know, it gives them a little bit extra of an illustration that the East also did something to men. I think that will be actually quite interesting next follow-up to think more about what happens in that case. Then also to Max's point about, like, you know, the differences across time. So what we do here is we look at the length of socialization. So you could be 1 year socialized within the regime, or max of 40 years socialized within the regime. So what we look at here is if the length of socialization East and West, if that then matters. So that becomes so we have East-West, not times birth cohort, but times length of being socialized, right? And then these are kind of the marginal effects. And here you see the longer you are socialized, so, you know, the period of between 30 and 40, that there's a more pronounced difference in gender attitudes where the GDR is clearly much more progressive than the West. So even though I will totally acknowledge the fact that it's difficult to really identify what exactly about the East it is, what is interesting to see from this analysis is that, well, East-West separation is definitely better than trying to compare Sweden to Italy, let's say, right? So that we have East-West separation leads to semi-exogenous imposition of different gender attitudes. This also works when we do within comparisons of Protestant regions, East-West, Catholic regions, East-West. We of course lose statistical power there. Also, when we look at, you know, kind of doing some forms of fixed effects for these different regions, the youngest birth cohorts socialized in post-war period display no significant difference between East and West, right? So that's interesting to say, but overall the differences exist for cohorts that are socialized during the Cold War among men and women. So taking away this idea that it might be something about resources, and that also the length of socialization matters. So that's kind of the first step, and hopefully I've convinced you of with some caveats, yeah, about which we're open. But now the question is, you know, do these attitudes also matter? You know, like as political scientists, maybe as sociologists, we would be super interested in this in of itself, but as political scientists and political economists, we might want to relate it to something that also affects political outcomes. So what we're trying to do here is to really try to see if these attitudes in turn affect the gender gap of political involvement in unified Germany. So what we do is we overall look just being in the East and West. Yeah, does that affect political involvement? Looking at the effect of traditional gender attitudes. This is all correlational. And what we do here is this is just to look at the differentiated effect of having an interaction where we have traditional gender attitudes estimating party membership or political interest. Party membership, of course, is a 0-1. Political interest is you know, we can either do as a scale also as a 0-1, high-low, and look at the differential effect for men and women. So what we see is that as you move along the x-axis of having more traditional gender attitudes, and then the predicted party membership or political interest levels, that the more traditional gender attitudes you have, the less likely you are active in political party life, or the less politically interested you are, but that the slopes are slightly more pronounced for women than they are for men. But interestingly, they're also there for men. So that's also interesting to just kind of acknowledge. I don't really have a clear answer to that, but women with more traditional gender attitudes are particularly less interested in politics and less likely to be involved in kind of political parties or organizations linking to activities linking to political parties. And in the appendix of the paper, we also look at turnout and in political efficacy. So the extent to which you think you can affect outcomes in politics. Yeah.
Did you do this for West Germany alone? Because I was thinking, I mean, this is just a really,
okay.
so because party membership, so the survey starts in 1991, right? So that's just a couple of years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So presumably in East Germany, a lot of people were party members for career, opportunistic reasons, right? So, I mean, this is not strictly speaking an East versus West question. So maybe you could just
exactly. So I am sure I ran it, Francesco, and I didn't get very concerns, but I cannot remember it in the top of my head but I think it's actually a very good good element that I hadn't thought about, especially in the earlier times when there was still the PDS, the Party for Democratic Socialism, which was the follow-up of the SED, of the German Communist Party. That you're right, that might be career strategic evaluation. So we do have, of course, as I said, also the turnout and political efficacy, but I will take note and look a bit more in depth into that, because that makes a very.
I'm guessing a lot of people didn't care and didn't bother to cancel themselves from,
exactly.
They have to do something to unsubscribe from the party.
Exactly, and a more convenient.
And then when asked, are you a member? Yeah, sure, I'm a member, but
exactly, more convenience element. No, it makes a lot of sense. I will look at that, and it actually makes maybe a bit of sense to maybe explicitly in the paper also to deal with that and to sub that a little bit. Yeah, I think that makes. Thank you. It's a very good point. Yeah. So the issue, of course, that I would have as someone who works more causally is like, oh, nice, but this is like regressing attitudes and attitudes, right? So we have gender attitudes on one side, and we have like self-declared political participation on the other. And also Francesco made some comments about, like this might also be problematic for some other reasons, not at all captured here, but that like it might be that in the East these levels are different. So that makes also a lot of sense to me. So what we do now is we basically borrow from the work of Washington in economics, where we look at the extent to which you have daughters, and we know that having daughters creates both women and men, especially men, but both women and men, to hold more progressive gender attitudes. And the reasoning behind that is that basically you don't want your own child to carry these kind of barriers, right? To allow them to reach kind of their in the kind of how we call it now in whatever self-help work, to reach your fullest potential, I guess, as a child, right? So what we do here is we try to basically see if there's this effect of gender, if there's a causal effect of traditional gender attitudes by instrumenting gender attitudes by if the person in the survey had daughters. And what we do is there are questions in the survey of those who live within the household, those children who are out of the household. So basically the children that they have, and they ask them about the sex of those children. So that allows us to capture this. Traditional gender attitudes, having daughters is a good instrument empirically for having traditional gender attitudes. It makes you less likely to hold traditional gender attitudes in the way that the established literature also suggests this. And then these are the effects of a second stage, where we have instrumented traditional gender attitudes on political interest and party membership using having daughters. So we see indeed that so if you then don't have daughters, that would be the traditional side here, right? Has a negative effect on political interest and party membership, while the reverse then is true is when you have a daughter, right? So this gives us a little bit of a sense that it might be some causal relationship between having these kind of gender attitudes then instrumented through having a daughter in your family or as a child, and some political involvement. And that also holds not just for political interest and party membership, as we show here, but also for using turnout or using political efficacy, as we do in the supporting information. So then comes the part of the paper that we go a bit back and forth on. So it's really interesting to hear you as well. So from the reading of our literature, what seems to be the kind of signature policy of the GDR was putting people through education, and specifically women through education. And it was also the really difference to that. There's also really some nice work in economics by Pamela Campa and others that really shows also that women within communist regimes more generally, but she specifically looked at the East, also have levels of higher professional ambition coming from these kind of elements, and also are much more likely to be in certain fields of work that and study certain things at university that in many West European countries we have an issue of pushing women in, let's say STEM, right? So that's a kind of interesting element. So what we did in our particular paper here is to try to explore a mechanism, and then particularly explore the mother's educational attainment. We do also a little bit with having a working mom, but then in the West, the number of observations are so little for having a working mom that it's a bit difficult to empirically establish this, right? So So what we do here is we basically look at, there's a question in the survey asking if your mom had any form of higher, upper level high school to tertiary, so to university education, or even beyond that in the survey, and then we group those. So this is basically the kind of tracking of those respondents having mothers with high levels of education. I mean, this goes virtually to almost everyone in the GDR, right? In the period of that we're looking at. And of course, it's going up in the West, like it's going in many other Western European countries or advanced industrial economies. But, you know, it was less, the gradient is less steep, right? It's much more gradual in the West. So what we now try to do is to kind of explore a little bit the mechanism, is to say, well, what if we group East and West by having a low education mother versus having a high education mother, right? So what we see is that actually that there is that within the East, I mean, there's some things about having not so many observations, right? Especially older in the East. But I mean, let's just kind of bear that with me here. But what you see basically is that both for the East and the West, but probably a little bit stronger for the West, is that you see it that the gender gap, that the egalitarian attitudes are more pronounced for those that have a high education mother. And also, of course, and the difference between East and West are less pronounced, right? Interestingly, of course, is that for the East, I do have to admit that drop is not as stark as it is for the West. So that maybe also illustrates that there's something else about the East, just the fact that women, maybe the ideology that was provided or etc., that also exacerbates this. So I think it illustrates that there is an effect of having, of pushing women into higher education, and that will lead both men and women, so sons and daughters, to hold more gender egalitarian attitudes. But probably there is also something of the East in and of itself, and that could be maybe some party rhetoric. We see kind of the same effect when we look through job attainment of women, but there we have the issue that in the West earlier on we don't have that many. The other element which we also tried to look at was religion of the mother, but there of course we have very little variation in the East, right? In the sense of also that place that definitely also will play a role. So we think that, also having read a lot of the kind of qualitative work that pushing women into the public, especially through education, seems to have very, very positive effect, but we're not going to say that that's the only mechanism that drives it. If you have other ideas, so I've already told you some other things that we thought about religion and also about employment, which have some concerns about just from the estimation side. We don't think that they're not important, right? We want to hear that, but also looking into especially the manuals of teachers that I said, but also looking at some of the curriculum. So just giving you some of the examples that, like in the East, there was in math examples, there are women's names, but in the West for a long time there were not, right? There's also quite a lot of work to suggest that that's the case. So, it's also maybe something also about the content of education, but that's very difficult to really establish because of the fact that we don't have shifts in curriculum, right? Or not the ones that we can identify here. So, but there seems to be something about that educational attainment of the mom that plays a role, and that might be one mechanism through which this operates for us. So just to kind of conclude, I think I'm good in time. So why do women participate in and engage with politics at lower rates than men? So there's been a lot of evidence that's already being provided, but we also want to say that, even though original work was not able to really capture it that well and develop the story as to why, we do think that traditional gender attitudes are an important part of the puzzle, and hopefully have convinced you of that in the paper. So we try to do that by using a case where we can plausibly argue that there's been at least some semi-exogenous imposition of gender attitudes, especially because both of these regimes, in my comment to Max, came out of quite traditional gender attitudes regime within Nazi Germany, and then of course was imposed a much more progressive norm within the East and a much more traditional one, and only gradually with generational replacement changing a regime in the West. We also show that these traditional gender roles attitudes correlate negatively with political engagement and participation, and they also hold when we try to be more stringent and use an IV approach. And we explore somewhat of a channel through which this might operate, and that would be educational attainment of mothers. So in this case, I think if you buy some of what we are saying, that increasing women's involvement may not be a matter only of resources, with a lot of the evidence has suggested, but also maybe that we need to change women's beliefs about gender roles, but also men's beliefs about women's gender roles, right? So that might be an interesting thing to look at forward. And also, feel free to contact us if you have any ideas after this, and we look very much forward to your comments and suggestions. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much, Catherine. So you're perfectly on time. So we have a good 15 minutes for the Q&A. If anyone has a question, just feel free to, or any comment, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. And I see, Clement, you already had a point. There were a couple of points in the chat. There were more like suggestions than questions. So I don't know if...
I can ask a question
I think, yeah.
to get the ball rolling. So coming from Poland and being educated in the communist system, growing up through that, so I totally buy the gender role that was kind of imprinted by the concerted program of the government, but also there's an it seems to me there's an economic element to that. Some sort of position that women had because the government needed that, those roles to be fulfilled. These were bureaucratic countries, very bureaucratic, and it seems to me that this middle management intellectual roles had to be fulfilled by someone. They were not very glamorous, like they are in the West. They were not very well paid, like they are in the West. Usually, if you are middle management in industry, in administration, you are relatively well paid. They were not in Poland, at least I understand, in East Germany either. So if you wanted to have a glamorous, well-paid job, you were a miner. A miner or a steelwork, physical work. That was the pinnacle of the system. Now, if you're a woman, you become a librarian. You needed a higher education for that, so you went through that educational system. And it seems to me that maybe by coincidence that, because this is the springboard for the political career later on, like Merkel and everyone, you went through that. But at that time when you were investing, it wasn't a glamorous or well paid. Mm-hmm. So it's not an attitude; it's an economic situation. It's like a bit like, imagine it's like nurses or social work in the UK. It's incredibly difficult. It's incredibly not well paid, and it's mostly done by women. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, this becomes, after 91, this becomes something that is valuable. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a very good point. I mean, I think also what we really want to be clear about, I said that already, a bit of the double standard in some of these regimes. So that's what you were also referring to in terms of economically. But I guess that what we would say is that nonetheless, of course, has a different idea about the role that a woman is playing outside the house, right? So in the sense of what was in the West, there were not even the non-glamorous jobs that women were in, there were just none. Right. So, and the only jobs that were there, for example, also I come from a conservative welfare state, the Netherlands, but it goes the same for West Germany, that women, if they got pregnant, they were fired. Right. So that was the rule until the 60s. And then if women later on were allowed to still work, it was usually forms of like kindergarten education or lower levels of education and being a teacher, right? Or something like that. Maybe also librarian, what you said. So I think that's nonetheless the case. But I think that what our element is and what we're trying to capture is these differences in how people perceive that you have a role outside the home, and that if you have more of a sense of that there is a women's place outside the home, that might also translate into politics. Of course, Max, what you're saying, I have no possibility to, of course, go back in history and say if these women would have gotten different jobs, what would they, that's why I think we're also pretty open about the fact of what exactly it is about that. But we did look a little bit into differences of where women in the GDR said their mothers were working. So of course, there's not huge variation. That's definitely the case. But between that, there was not that one felt that they were more had stronger gender attitudes or not. So I think the literature for next step, I think this is really crucial. What you're saying is the sense of like, so there's way more to gender role attitudes than just the public versus private, which is what we're focusing on, right? But I think that there's another gradation, and that comes into especially claiming rights, right? And then claiming equal play, claiming better elements. But also if you look at it within kind of West Germany, that's a very recent discussion, right? That's a lot of that, it was just about getting jobs in the first place, right?
Is there any data on not wages necessarily, because the concept of a wage in Eastern Germany is also a bit
different
of a
relative. Yeah, exactly.
It's a different thing, but that would give us some sort of idea where in the social ladder those jobs were, whether whether low or whether they were high. Because my kind of proverbial example is this middle management, a deputy director at a school, a head teacher. Okay, incredibly mundane, very difficult job, very something that is an equivalent of a nurse in the UK, and equally badly paid. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that. And then after 91, all of a sudden these people have a springboard by pure coincidence in a way.
Yeah. So I don't think we have this wage information. I can double check, but I'm pretty sure we don't. I mean, the only thing I can not counter to it, but what I could at least say is that Pamela Kampa, who has also done some of this work, where she really also suggests that that was across the board in East Germany. So that seems to be irrespective of what your mom's job was, for example, that at least the level of ambition to work and to work long hours and to, for example, think that childcare is a right and these kind of things, that's way more pronounced among East German women. But I think what you're suggesting is really super interesting. I just don't think we can do it here, but I follow what your intuition.
Wouldn't a proxy for wages or because I think what Max is getting at is status, right? So wouldn't positioning the party hierarchy be a proxy? I don't know whether such data would exist.
I don't know. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You're in East, I mean, I'm not Eastern European, so I don't know. Max will know better than me, but presumably the perks came from being higher up in the party hierarchy rather than the job you did, right? Mm-hmm. So that might be what you.
Yeah, there could be a difference here between Poland and Germany, because in Poland it wasn't as pronounced.
Yeah, Germany.
I think in Germany it probably was.
State, right?
Yeah. But I can check. I have no idea if that is.
But I'm sure even in the party, there was a bit of a skew between lower ranks and higher ranks.
And there are many more women in the lower ranks. That's definitely the case. Yeah.
Yes.
Can I ask a couple of things about? So one of the things that I don't think it's really about what you're doing, but it's interesting is that there seems to be now an overtake. So the Eastern Europe is getting worse. It's not just that West Germany is catching up to Eastern Europe. The last cohorts in Eastern Europe, and this is just looking at a figure, right? So it's not that significant maybe, are getting worse. So are we watching an effect of an economic effect here, that Eastern Europe is increasingly lagging behind Western Germany, and so now they're becoming a less advanced society, even on this dimension? Because that's interesting, right?
Yeah, so you do have, of course, some of the migration that comes out because women are disproportionately hit by the transition. That's definitely the case. And then, I mean, overall, East Germany is quite hit in that respect. I also would like to acknowledge that, what I said, that a lot of the evidence suggests that basically what was there in terms of education and progressive education was basically overturned to a Western model. So in that way, it's not just that it was by design, if you will, but it is a bit tricky. And I mean, it goes beyond, but there is, of course, also examples of countries especially like a country like Latvia, Estonia. It also has to do with war casualties and things like that. But anyway, that their women are very pronounced within society. It's interestingly that there are, even though we see this on the gender attitudes a little bit, but I don't want to make too much out of it because I don't have data since then. But when you start looking at German women in kind of places of politics, for example, a lot of them are East German origin. So there does seem, so it seems to be of a bit going maybe of younger generations, a lost opportunity story perhaps in some moment in time, but then some who are socialized already longer, that they were able to get some of these chances. But I don't want to, as I said, I lack a little bit the more recent data to really give you a good answer to that. And it's interesting about, you know, how differences in different parts of Eastern Europe, also as Max was talking about, that yield very, very different images. Poland, the situation in Poland is very different than the situation in Estonia, for example, right? Or in Latvia. So you know, I don't want to extrapolate too much from this particular case.
Great. I think Stephanie had a question.
Well, not so much of a question. I would say from my experience, because I'm from the east of my family, that what Max said is true, that those jobs where you needed to have a higher educational degree were worse paid in the east. That's what I have heard from everyone I know. Although I'm not sure what kind of data there is. I would still wonder, so if you run your models separately for East and West, if that's possible with the numbers, how big is the difference between men and women, for example, or lower and higher educated? I'm not sure. Maybe I just missed that, because you had the model where you put an East.
Yeah, exactly. I have that. I can do that. I mean, it's quite in terms of like points on the traditional gender scale. You mean? I can very quickly look for you.
Yes. So I would just be interested if the effects of gender attitudes are different if you look just at the East and just at the West in your model. So if you run two separate models,
yeah,
that the difference might not be even so big. Then also,
no. So the difference seems to be much more among East and West than among men and women within the West, men and women within the East, right? Yeah. So which illustrates a little bit this idea that I said, that is something about the regime rather than about, right? But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I couldn't find it, but I mean, you know, from some other research, you know that people in the East are like less involved into politics, that they kind of had to learn it after reunification, because they always just had
but that bias is actually against our finding, right? So then it's actually more surprising that we find what we find, because remember, those in the East are the ones who hold more egalitarian gender attitudes, and then has a positive effect on political involvement. So even if there are level differences, right? So there's still an effect from that. So knowing that that's even the case, it's actually biasing against our element, right? Or against what we would expect, that there might be this other effect of East, but so that within the East, those that hold more traditional gender attitudes, more egalitarian gender attitudes, right? That they are disproportionately much more likely to be involved. That's kind of the story then, right? But yeah, no, I agree with that. So Politikverdrossenheit is, and you're saying the German term, right? Yeah. No, thanks. And I will also look at these wages in the sense of that might be true. And I think this element of like that, of course, what we are capturing is not what they were doing in the GDR, but it's 1991. So what they're then later on doing. So Max, it could be also this what you say, it definitely might be the case that they're then higher educated, and the returns on that are much better in quote unquote unified Germany than they were previously, right?
Hi, can I ask a question? Well, first of all, Catherine, this is fascinating. I have a fascinating project overall. I was wondering if I could ask a question a little bit about the social context and what was, just because I found those results that you presented where it was also dropping for men and just the gap was wider for women. I thought that was fascinating. And I want to caveat with, I work in a totally different context. So I'm like a product of US public schools. So I was like, oh, Germany, that's cool. So like I know very little about Europe in general. But what I know from my work is that a lot of these types of things, like, you know, we like the what looks like attitudes is actually something about social recognition. And the fact that those types of activities are generally devalued among like the communities or the networks that hold those views. So for example, one view might be that that what the traditional gender attitude is just measuring like, you know, the groups and communities that also devalue things like political involvement. And I don't know if there's any way to see this with the data, but for example, in my work, what I find is that a lot of it is driven by men. So men will reward women who are doing traditional things in this context, and then so if you want to be somebody that's prominent and influential within your little community, then you end up needing to do things that are not political, because that's something that's undervalued as a whole by the rest of the community. And so I know like this, so to me, I'm just thinking about like this, and does this enter in some sort of type of framework where they're thinking about this as like as politics being a less rewarding type of activity for them, or a less useful type of activity for them versus other things that they could do, like join a union or engage,
church organization.
yeah, some sort of PTA leadership, you know, the other things that women might seek leadership and social influence on. But I was wondering if you had any ideas about what that, you know, whether any elements of that might be operating. I do get, I think like, you know, the Southeast Asia is a very sort of social networky type of place in general. So I imagine that probably the effects are larger there than it would be in a place where it's more about sort of individual efficacy, and, you know, there's a lot more individual drivers of political participation. But if you had any thoughts on that like super ill-formed question, I'd much
No, it's a great question, and it's actually quite funny because I was it's good to see you now, not only on Twitter, but it's like in exactly on Zoom. That's great. And hopefully we see each other at some conference soon. But I was presenting at Berkeley actually, and Pradeep Chibber actually made very similar comments. So it might be also in the sense of that there's this idea about what it means in different elements. So I think some elements are really interesting in the sense, because of course what you also read from the kind of more historiography from women in the East is that it didn't mean, of course, that they were basically doing a little bit of, let's say, not fully double shift, because they were also doing stuff at home, but they, you know, the men were doing more things, but it was not in any way egalitarian at the home either. But they had this public aspect to it as well. I think in the sense of how to deal with it, in sense of what you're saying, is that it is interesting, and it could be in some ways that it's also a bit of a replacement story. So that it could be that these women in the West, of course, then are active, but in different things than political. It would fit still what Diana and I would think about more private and public, or more gender norm orientated behavior in one or the other. And I think maybe we have some questions about that, like activity in other things. So it might very well be that you see that in that way. I mean, you also have that a little bit. I don't know, we all have maybe some friends who are super highly educated and then are taking a break with women, and they become the PTA champions, you know, like this. It's also the fact of like putting the energy somewhere else. But that could definitely also be, is because if you're in a more gender traditional environment, that would be a more acceptable, and the other thing would be more norm breaking in some ways. So it will be more reputational costs associated with that. And so I hadn't thought about that, but I think that's an interesting element. And I think we have maybe some traction on this with looking at other forms of involvement that are not, you know, exclusively political. Yeah, good. I'll take note. Thanks.
Great. So I think we're basically out of time, so we'll stop the recording. But if anyone has any additional question, feel free to hang around for a little bit longer. And I'll see everyone on April 19th.